Somewhere in the Vietnamese military archive, there is a category of threat assessment that does not appear in any other Army's operational documents from this war. Not dangerous, not well-trained, not effective. The category is Ma Rung. It translates roughly as phantoms of the jungle. It appears in formal institutional documents, the kind produced for commanding officers, not for frightened soldiers gathered around fires, because the officers producing those documents had exhausted every natural explanation available to them and reached, in the end, for language from a different register entirely. They were not writing about the Americans. They were not writing about helicopters, or B-52s, or the 500,000 men and the full weight of industrial-age warfare. Tell me in the comments before we go further, which country do you think the North Vietnamese feared most in that jungle? Because what you are about to discover is not in any history book you were taught from. Stay until the end. The Australian government announced on the 24th of May, 1962, that it was sending 30 military advisors to South Vietnam. The word advisors was carefully chosen. It was chosen because the word soldiers would have required explaining what those soldiers were being sent to do, and what they were being sent to do was not something the government was prepared to explain publicly. They were going to train South Vietnamese units in jungle warfare and counterinsurgency operations. They were going to embed with American Special Forces programs and CIA operations that did not officially exist in any document the public would ever read. They were going to carry a mandate from the head of the Australian Secret Intelligence Service that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with buying time. Time for the nations of Southeast Asia to strengthen themselves against communist insurgency, and time, in the precise words of ACS Director Sir Walter Cawthorne, to help destroy the Soviet Union economically. The ISIS director had given this instruction to Serong directly, quietly, in a meeting that did not appear in any parliamentary record. 30 men. Trainers. That was the official description. The gap between that description and the actual mandate was not a small one. It was the gap between a press release and a strategic intelligence directive, and it was the gap inside which everything that followed would occur. On the 3rd of August, 1962, the main body of what would become known simply as the team, the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, the AATTV, boarded a commercial flight from Singapore to Saigon. They wore civilian clothes, 29 of them, short-haired, strong-looking men in ordinary clothing, who did not look like what they were, because looking like what they were was, in the phrase used by their own government's briefing documents, diplomatically sensitive. One by one, over the course of that flight, each man got up from his seat, walked to the aircraft lavatory, and emerged in the jungle-green combat uniform of the Australian Army. By the time the aircraft landed in Saigon, the transformation was complete. Australia's first soldiers in its longest war had arrived. Almost nobody was watching. That, too, was deliberate. Colonel Francis Philip Serong, Ted Serong to everyone who knew him, had already arrived 3 days earlier. He was 46 years old, a graduate of the Royal Military College at Duntroon, a veteran of the Second World War, whose most significant post-war contribution had been the Jungle Warfare Training Center at Canungra in southeast Queensland, which he had commanded from 1955, and where he had spent 2 years developing the counterinsurgency doctrine that would shape Australian military thinking for the next generation. He had subsequently advised the Burmese army in jungle warfare tactics, returned to Australia via Saigon, looked at the deteriorating situation in South Vietnam, and formed views about what addressing it would require. Those views were sharply at odds with American assumptions and would, over the following decade, prove entirely correct. Serong had been selected for Vietnam by Lieutenant General Pollard, his close friend and superior, with authority to act unilaterally in the field. He arrived in Saigon and established a headquarters. The rest of the team dispersed across the country. This dispersal shaped everything about what the AATTV would become and everything about what it would cost its members. The unit met as a complete body only on Anzac Day, and once more on the 30th of September, 1970, when General Crichton Abrams presented them with the U.S. Army Meritorious Unit Commendation at Vung Tau. In 10 years of continuous active service, the unit that would become the most decorated of the Vietnam War assembled as a complete force exactly twice outside of ceremony. The rest of the time, its members operated alone or in pairs, embedded in South Vietnamese units, American advisory teams, and special forces structures across the full length of the country, from the demilitarized zone in the north to the Mekong Delta in the south. A federal member of parliament surveyed this arrangement and called them what the government's own deployment structure had already decided: the expendables. They had also been told, for the first 2 years of service, that they were not permitted to participate in combat operations. This restriction was not merely impractical, it was actively counterproductive. Men who could not fight beside the soldiers they were training could not convincingly demonstrate the techniques they were teaching, and the soldiers they were training knew it. The ban also carried a more corrosive consequence that the government had not anticipated. An advisor who steps behind his students when the shooting starts has communicated something about his own limitations that no amount of classroom instruction can subsequently repair. The Vietnamese units the team was embedded with were not slow to draw that conclusion. When the restriction was finally lifted in mid-1964, AATTV members were released into a role they had been functionally performing anyway, except now they could do it without the pretense. After which they regularly encountered fiercer fighting than anything the task force infantry, with their armored support and artillery availability, ever faced. They went into contact as individual advisors embedded in Vietnamese units, with no unit cohesion behind them, no Australian evacuation plan above them, and frequently no clear line of communication to anyone who shared their language or their training. These were not the conditions of a training mission. They were the conditions of a war, fought by men who had been told, for diplomatic reasons, that they were doing something else. Serong's philosophy, stated in his own words, was the philosophical engine beneath everything the AATTV and the SASR would subsequently accomplish. Conventional soldiers, he said, thought of the jungle as being full of lurking enemies. Under the Australian system, the Australians would do the lurking. This was not a metaphor. It was the operational principle that would eventually cause a professional army to reach for the vocabulary of ghosts. To understand how that principle was developed, tested, and carried to Vietnam, you have to go back not to 1962, but further still, to the institutional inheritance that made these men different from every other force operating in that theater. The most complete early expression of what that principle could accomplish in Vietnam came from a member of the AATTV, whose operation was so effective and so uncomfortable for the people funding it that it became the single most tightly held Australian secret of the entire war. Captain Barry Peterson arrived in South Vietnam in 1963. He was 28 years old, had served in the Malayan Emergency, and had developed specific expertise in working with mountain tribal populations in counterinsurgency contexts. This was precisely why the CIA's Covert Action Branch had identified him and arranged, through channels the Australian government understood and officially knew nothing about, for him to be deployed to the Central Highlands. Peterson was the first Australian the CIA's Covert Action Branch permitted to run what they called a field program in Vietnam. Not in 1965, when America announced its combat escalation. In 1963, 2 years before American Marines landed at Da Nang, 2 years before Australia committed a full infantry battalion, 2 years before any of the public narrative of the war had even begun to form. His introduction to the operation took place in a quiet section of CIA headquarters in Saigon. Acoustic tiles covered the walls and ceiling. There were maps, office furniture, a disproportionate number of large combination safes, half a dozen Americans in the main room, some in suits, jackets discarded. CIA money arrived in bags from Saigon and was replenished when Peterson submitted receipts. He was given his assignment: recruit, train, and lead a Montagnard guerrilla force in Darlac province, disrupting Viet Cong supply lines through the Central Highlands and preventing communist base establishment in the area, and told explicitly not to be seen as part of the American operation. Working alone was the condition of the job. This was familiar territory for an Australian officer of his generation and training. The Canungra doctrine that Serong had built emphasized individual initiative and small group independence above almost everything else. Peterson had been trained for exactly this kind of isolation. Through patient social integration, learning the language, socializing, building trust with tribal elders before anyone picked up a weapon, Peterson recruited an initial 100 men. By 1965, the Truong Sun Force numbered 1,200 fighters across multiple bases. The CIA supplied tiger print camouflage uniforms. The pattern gave the force its name. The Tigermen developed a reputation that moved through the Central Highlands faster than any Viet Cong counter-operation could address. Supply lines along the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Peterson's territory were disrupted with a consistency that forced the enemy to reroute and delay. Viet Cong agents were tracked and eliminated. The Montagnards named one of their additional bases Dam San after him, their word for a legendary warrior who was victorious in all his battles and could not be conquered except by the spirit of the sun. An Australian Army captain, funded with CIA receipts and resupplied by Air America flights to a jungle airstrip, had become a raid legend. The CIA, observing this, grew increasingly uncomfortable with what it had created. In September of 1964, a large Montagnard revolt broke out. The accumulated resentment of tribal people against South Vietnamese governmental encroachment finding its moment. Peterson was simultaneously the most trusted foreigner in the Highlands and the only person positioned to function as a credible intermediary between rebel leaders and South Vietnamese authority. Under conditions of genuine personal risk, he negotiated directly with both sides and helped prevent what might have become a significant regional destabilization. He received the Military Cross. Ambassador Maxwell Taylor, learning of this success, asked a single question: why is an American not doing this? The CIA's discomfort had been building for months before the revolt. The formal assessment was that Peterson had developed a personality cult, that his influence over the Montagnard people had become too autonomous, too specifically identified with their cause in ways that made the broader American program uncomfortable. He was asked to turn his Tigermen into counter-terror teams for the Phoenix program, targeting civilian Viet Cong sympathizers for assassination. He refused. The request was repeated. He refused again. He was ordered out in October of 1965, departing after farewell ceremonies at Montagnard longhouses involving animal sacrifices and home-brewed rice wine. His CIA replacement arrived and failed immediately to gain the respect of either the Montagnards or the Vietnamese. The Viet Cong re-established influence in the Highlands with a speed that confirmed precisely what Peterson had built, because the most reliable measure of what a program has accomplished is what happens to the territory it protected in the weeks after it ends. Years later, Peterson learned what had been prepared for him had he refused to leave. Both the South Vietnamese government and elements of the CIA had made arrangements to have him killed. A man who had faithfully served his government in a classified operation his government would not acknowledge had been targeted for elimination by the allies he was helping. He was no Colonel Kurtz, not a man broken by an impossible war, but a man who had built trust through hard work and honesty, and who had been removed when that trust became inconvenient to the people funding it. He published his account, Tiger Men, in 1988. The book's description called it a book the CIA would rather not see in print. Peterson died on the 28th of February, 2019, in Bangkok, aged 84. He held 13 medals for service in Vietnam, Borneo, and Malaysia. The full operational record of his program in the Highlands remains partially classified to this day. While Peterson operated in the hills, something else was being constructed in the southeast of the country. Something whose institutional roots went back not to 1962, but to 1943, and whose full significance would only become apparent when a professional army reached for vocabulary that professional military organizations do not normally employ. The lineage that eventually produced Rung begins in Singapore Harbor, late at night, in September of 1943. 6 men in folding kayaks, skin-dyed brown, moving silently between Japanese vessels to attach limpet mines to the hulls below the waterline. Operation Jaywick, Z Special Unit, a predominantly Australian Joint Allied Special Forces unit, conducting clandestine reconnaissance, sabotage, and long-range penetration operations behind Japanese lines across Borneo and the Dutch East Indies. 81 covert operations in the Southwest Pacific Theater. Men inserted by parachute and submarine, directed to disappear into hostile territory and accomplish objectives that conventional forces could not reach and that governments could not publicly claim. Those men returned from the war to a particular kind of silence. The Official Secrets Act imposed a 30-year prohibition on discussing their service with anyone, including family members, until the 1980s. The pattern was established then: achievement conducted in darkness, followed by institutional silence that outlasted the emergency it had served. It is a pattern that will appear again before this story ends. Z Special Unit was disbanded after the war as part of the general demobilization. The institutional memory it had generated did not disappear with it. The techniques, the doctrines, the philosophical orientation towards small team operations in hostile territory, where the primary advantage is the one the enemy does not know you have. These things persisted in the men who had practiced them, and in the training institutions those men subsequently influenced. In the 1950s, after observing British Special Air Service operations during the Malayan Emergency, the Australian Army established the first Special Air Service Company at Swanbourne in Perth on the 25th of July, 1957. Expanded to regimental status on the 20th of August, 1964, it shared the motto of the British SAS, "Who dares wins." Before Vietnam, there was Borneo. Between 1965 and 1966, the SASR conducted operations during the Indonesian confrontation, reconnaissance patrols, and cross-border operations into Indonesian territory, classified and not publicly acknowledged for years. The cross-border work demanded an absolute standard of concealment because the Australian government could not afford to have its soldiers found operating on Indonesian soil. Invisibility was not a tactical preference in Borneo. It was a political necessity. By the time 3 Squadron SASR deployed to Vietnam in June of 1966, the regiment carried 23 years of continuous live operational experience in terrain almost identical to Phuoc Tuy Province. Not theory, not doctrine rehearsed on training ranges, but institutional memory refined across 3 campaigns on 2 continents, absorbed into the reflexes of officers and NCOs who had been doing this in one form or another since before some of the men they were leading were born. The Americans had not accumulated comparable experience. Dean Rusk, the United States Secretary of State, admitted frankly at the ANZUS meeting in Canberra in May of 1962 that the U.S. Armed Forces knew little about jungle warfare. He was speaking to the country that had been doing almost nothing else for 2 decades. The Australians had a name for the kind of soldier this produced. They called it a lurker, a man who did not wait to be found, but who chose the terms, the timing, and the ground. 3 Squadron arrived at Vung Tau on the 16th of June, 1966, and moved to Nui Dat the following day. First enemy contact came on the 25th of June. By the end of that month, as the task force base developed and infantry battalions began patrolling the immediate area, the SASR began ranging further. Their first long-range patrol was to the Nui Din Hills, 7 kilometers west of Nui Dat. Within weeks, they were operating across Phuoc Tuy Province and into the adjacent provinces of Bien Hoa, Long Con, and Binh Tui. 4- and 5-man patrols moving through terrain the enemy had controlled for 20 years, going where the enemy felt safe, watching what the enemy believed was unwatched, recording what the enemy believed was unrecorded, and doing all of it in a way that left no evidence of their passage. Gerald Stone was a journalist who spent time with Australian infantry in 1966 and subsequently filed a report describing the patrols. He found them genuinely frustrating to accompany. It took 9 hours, by his account, to cover a single mile of terrain. He intended this as an observation about an unusual pace. It was, in fact, an incomplete observation about an unusual discipline whose purpose he had watched without comprehending. What he was recording as frustration was, from the patrol's perspective, the precise execution of a method that had been 23 years in development. Standard military synthetic clothing produced a characteristic friction noise when the legs moved against each other, a swishing sound that carries through still jungle air at distances that surprise anyone who has not specifically measured it under field conditions. Metal identification discs bounce against the sternum with each step and can be detected at 60 meters on a still night. Metal canteens produce the sound of water moving against a hard container with every stride, a percussive note an experienced listener can identify and track at considerable range. One documented observation of a standard American patrol moving at normal operational pace through medium-density vegetation counted 27 separate identifiable unnatural sounds in 30 meters of movement. 27 individual acoustic signals that together announced the presence of human beings, indicated their direction of travel, and gave an experienced listener a reasonable estimate of their number. Any Viet Cong tracker positioned downwind knew a standard patrol was coming well before it entered visual range, which meant the standard patrol was always reactive, always responding to contact on ground, and at a moment the enemy had chosen. The SASR patrol produced none of these signals. Metal canteens were replaced with soft plastic bladders that made no sound when the bearer moved. All metal components capable of contacting other metal were taped in place or replaced with cord or rope that produced nothing. Weapons were modified by the soldiers themselves, hacksaws and files removing every unnecessary component, adjusting the tools to the engagement distances that actually occurred in dense vegetation, rather than the specifications that training ranges rewarded. Boots were cut with drainage slits in the sides, a modification that would have troubled any quartermaster responsible for equipment standards, because in terrain where soldiers waded through streams and standing water every day, waterproof boots simply trapped moisture inside and produced trench foot within a week. The resulting patrol created an acoustic profile indistinguishable, in any practical sense, from the natural jungle environment it moved through. A patrol of 5 men could pass within 20 meters of a resting enemy soldier and register as nothing more than wind through the canopy. The technique was 15 to 20 meters of movement, then a complete freeze lasting anywhere from 15 minutes to half an hour. Let the jungle resume its natural sound pattern around the patrol. Let whatever small creatures had been disturbed by the movement settle back into their routines. Assess whether anything in that pattern indicates awareness, indicates movement that should not be there, indicates that something has changed since the last freeze. Then move again. 9 hours to cover 1 mile is not slow. It is the systematic construction of invisibility, one deliberate step at a time, until the patrol has become part of the environment's background in the perception of anyone listening for it. It is the principle that Serong had articulated in his briefing rooms, and that the SASR had practiced in Malaya and Borneo, and was now applying in a Vietnamese province where the enemy had spent 20 years believing itself to be invisible. When contact came, the response was the calculated, violent opposite of everything that preceded it. Immediate, overwhelming automatic weapons fire in the general direction of the enemy. Not carefully aimed single shots at identified targets, but a sustained burst achieving 2 things simultaneously: suppressing the enemy's ability to maneuver in those first critical seconds, and creating in every mind, receiving it, an impression of force substantially larger than 5 men. A soldier experiencing an immediate and ferocious return of fire cannot, in those first seconds, distinguish 5 men shooting at maximum rate from 25 men shooting normally. The confusion is genuine. It lasts long enough, 30 seconds, perhaps 45, for the patrol to break contact and begin the process of disappearing into the vegetation again. One formal military analysis of SASR contact procedure noted that the immediate retaliation with a heavy volume of automatic fire, even without clear target identification, served not only to suppress the immediate threat, but to create the illusion of a substantially larger force. This was not an accidental byproduct of the drill. It was an intentional design feature, built into the doctrine the same way every other element of the patrol had been engineered rather than assumed. The slow invisibility and the sudden ferocity were 2 sides of the same philosophy. Be nothing until the moment you need to be everything. The aggregate results across the full period of SASR operations in Vietnam are extraordinary by any comparative measure. 580 Australians served with the regiment in Vietnam across just over 5 years. They conducted 1,175 patrols. Enemy casualties: 492 confirmed killed, 106 assessed as probable, 47 wounded, 11 taken prisoner. Own casualties: 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, 1 death from illness. 28 men were wounded. The highest kill ratio of any Australian unit in Vietnam, achieved by groups of 4 to 6 men operating in territory the enemy considered its own, without armored support, without reliably available artillery, without the helicopter gunship cover that American forces treated as a prerequisite for extended operations in hostile terrain. These numbers did not emerge from a series of large engagements. They accumulated across 5 years of patrols, contact after contact, ambush after ambush, each one a small event that produced no headlines and accumulated into a record that had no parallel anywhere in the war. By 1970, 5 years of continuous SASR activity had taught the enemy something specific about how these patrols arrived. They had learned to recognize the patterns of helicopter insertions, the sound of an insertion-configured aircraft, the timing between landing and a patrol moving off the zone into cover. Observation teams appeared near predictable landing points. On several occasions, patrols came under fire in the moments immediately after landing, before the men had moved away from the zone and into cover. The SASR response to this intelligence adaptation was characteristic of their fundamental approach to every tactical problem. Not incremental variation of the landing zone selection, but a complete deception operation designed around the insertion itself. 2 helicopters carrying 2 separate patrols would land simultaneously in the same general area. After 5 minutes of moving together, the first patrol continued its actual mission, while the second stopped, waited an additional 5 minutes, and was extracted. To any observer in the surrounding jungle, 2 patrols had landed and 1 had been extracted. Which was real? In which direction had it gone? The confusion bought the remaining patrol the critical minutes it needed to vanish entirely into the vegetation. Every tactical problem, including the problem of how to arrive in the field safely, treated as a design challenge rather than an inconvenience to be managed. This was the defining institutional characteristic of the SASR in Vietnam. They did not accept the conditions they were given. They redesigned them. Major Reginald Beasley, who commanded 3 Squadron during its second Vietnam tour in 1969, kicked down the kills boards that previous squadrons had erected to track enemy dead. "We were not there to kill people," he said, "but to gain information." In the middle of a war, the Americans were prosecuting under a doctrine that treated body count as the primary measure of progress. An Australian SAS squadron commander destroyed his own side's body count records. The information those patrols gathered fed directly into the larger intelligence picture that made the task force's operations coherent, its ambushes precise, and its understanding of enemy movement superior to anything the enemy believed possible. The enemy's response to what the SASR was doing was not another tactical adaptation. It was institutional. It appeared in documents produced for their own commanding officers. And the language of those documents is where this story stops being a record of operational achievement and becomes something that requires a different kind of attention entirely. The most precise assessments of Australian effectiveness in Vietnam did not come from after-action reports, from Allied command assessments, or from the academic histories that would eventually be written about the campaign. They came from the enemy, in documents produced for their own leadership, using the unguarded institutional language that military organizations employ when genuinely attempting to explain to their own commanders why operations keep failing to produce the expected results. Brigadier E.P. Chamberlain served as an intelligence officer in Vietnam in 1969 and 70, later became Director of Military Intelligence, and served as Australia's defense attaché in Cambodia and Indonesia. He spent years after the war translating and analyzing communist Vietnamese military documents and conducting interviews with former enemy officers, including personnel from units that fought the Australians directly. His analysis, published in 2023, 57 years after Long Tan, confirmed what the operational record had shown from a different direction. The enemy's own documents, written for themselves with no thought of outside readers, said plainly what Allied institutional records had understated or omitted. The designation May Rung appeared not in the informal accounts of soldiers gathered around fires, but in formal military documents of the kind produced for commanding officers. When an army's institutional language reaches for the supernatural, something specific has happened. The natural explanations have been exhausted. Conventional tactical analysis has failed to produce a workable counter. The threat has apparently exceeded everything the standard framework can accommodate. Rather than leave it undescribed, the document reaches for vocabulary from an entirely different register. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army reached for the language of ghosts. The designation Viet Kich, elite special forces operating at the highest level of independent tactical skill, carried a different and perhaps more analytically precise meaning. Communist military histories applied this classification not merely to SASR troopers, but to standard Australian regular infantry battalion elements, placing them in the same institutional tier as the most capable fighters the enemy expected to encounter anywhere in the conflict. not for any specific battle or extraordinary circumstance. For the routine and consistent manner of patrolling, the degree of independent initiative demonstrated at small unit level, the persistent capacity to appear where the enemy did not expect and to be gone before any organized response could be assembled. Men doing the ordinary work of a counterinsurgency infantry battalion had been classified, by their enemy's own formal doctrine, in the category reserved for forces that conventional analysis could not adequately explain. This was not a post-war reassessment offered with the benefit of distance and hindsight. It was a contemporary classification produced during the fighting by people who were actively trying to defeat these men and needed language that explained why their standard methods kept failing. A standing operational preference emerged from these assessments. Enemy forces generally sought to avoid contact with task force patrols, except under conditions assessed as strongly favorable, a phrase that appears repeatedly across multiple communist operational records. Main force units repositioned away from areas known to be under SASR coverage. Supply parties moved with extreme caution and still walked into prepared positions at rates without precedent in the enemy's experience elsewhere in the country. There was no single formal order reading "Do not engage the Australians." There was the accumulated practical conclusion of every unit that had attempted the alternative and found the tactical mathematics consistently producing the wrong result, documented in their own records, confirmed 50 years later by their own veterans in interviews conducted by an Australian intelligence officer who had earned the right to ask those questions through a career spent understanding exactly what the documents meant. The SASR also provided instructors to the MACV Recondo School, the United States Army's primary long-range reconnaissance training facility. The Americans, with their considerable resources and enormous force commitment, were being taught long-range patrol doctrine by Australians. Some SASR members served on exchange with MACVSOG units, the most classified American Special Operations program of the war, whose activities across the region remain partially described in open sources. Their presence in that program was not publicly acknowledged at the time and has essentially disappeared from American military memory. There is no chapter in any American Special Operations history beginning with the words we called Australia. The same institutional assessment that produced M.I. Rung for the SASR extended to the AATTV, regular advisors embedded with Vietnamese units, operating alone or in pairs, carrying the Canungra contact drills Serong had built into their training, were classified in communist military histories within the same elevated category as the SASR troopers. The unit a federal MP had called the Expendables, the unit whose members assembled as a complete force only twice in 10 years. Those men were the enemy's definition of elite. All 4 Victoria Crosses awarded to Australians in the entire Vietnam War went to members of the AATTV, not the Task Force Infantry, not the SASR, the trainers, the Expendables. Warrant Officer Kevin Arthur Wheatley, Dasher to everyone who knew him, a name earned on a rugby field years before any of this, had arrived in Vietnam in March of 1965. He was 28 years old, a veteran of the Malayan emergency. Earlier in his Vietnam tour, during a firefight between ARVN troops and a trapped Viet Cong unit, a Vietnamese child had run into the crossfire. Wheatley ran through it after her, shielded her with his body, and carried her out. This was not recognized with a formal award. It was included in an early draft of his subsequent citation as evidence of character, considered relevant, then set aside as not strictly necessary for the formal recommendation. Character evidence deemed unnecessary. On the 13th of November, 1965, a civil irregular defense group company began a search and destroy operation in the Tra Bong Valley in Quang Ngai Province. Accompanying the force were Captain Felix Fazekas as senior Australian advisor and warrant officers Wheatley and Ron Swanton with one platoon. The company came under heavy fire from a larger Viet Cong force. Swanton was mortally wounded. The CIDG company broke and ran, the weight of fire against them exceeding whatever held them to their positions. Wheatley, himself unwounded, requested support and a medical evacuation. Support did not arrive in time. Medical personnel and his own senior officer urged him to leave. He carried Swanton toward a safer position. The Viet Cong closed around them. Both men were found dead. He had stayed beside his wounded mate when every rational assessment of the situation said he should have left. He received the first Australian Victoria Cross of the Vietnam War, posthumously at age 28. Peter Badco was known as the Galloping Major because he was always moving toward the point where the situation was worst and leadership was most needed. Between the 23rd of February and the 7th of April of 1967, Badco performed extraordinary operations on 3 separate occasions, leading assaults across open ground under heavy fire, each time with different units, each time at a different location in Thua Thien Province. He was killed on the 3rd occasion. Multiple assessments concluded that under different circumstances, he could have been recommended for a second Victoria Cross within the same citation period. The period in which he died was also the period in which he might have received it twice. There is no category for that. Warrant Officer Rayeen Stewart Simpson, Ray or Cobber, to those who served alongside him, had fought in Korea with the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, and then in Malaya, before joining the AATTV for his first Vietnam tour in July of 1962. He returned to Australia in 1966 and discharged at his own request. Civilian life did not hold him. He returned to Saigon at his own expense in May of 1967 and re-enlisted as a private, the lowest rank available to him, was reinstated to warrant officer within the AATTV almost immediately, and continued. On the 6th of May, 1969, near the Laotian border in Kontum Province, Simpson was commanding the 232nd Mobile Strike Force Company on a search and clear operation when one of his platoons became heavily engaged. Placing himself at the front of his troops, he drew enemy fire deliberately away from the men behind him and led the assault on the enemy's left flank. When the Vietnamese commander became a casualty, Simpson assumed command, organized the defense, and held position through repeated attacks until a relief force arrived. He was awarded the Victoria Cross. He was also awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for a separate action 5 years earlier, in which, severely wounded in the leg, he had assumed command of a leaderless unit and held off a Viet Cong force until relief arrived. 2 separate acts, 2 separate wars, one man who kept coming back because he did not know how to stop. Simpson died in 1978. Keith Payne's action carried its own distinct weight. In May of 1969, in tri-border country near Laos, his Mike Force unit was ambushed and scattered in the darkness. Payne spent the night alone in enemy territory, searching systematically, finding demoralized survivors one by one, rallying approximately 40 men, and leading them back to safety. Not a single decisive violent act, a night of patient, deliberate, solitary work, the reassembly of a broken force through force of will. The Australia that sent these men to fight called itself a training mission. The enemy that faced them called them elite commandos and ghosts. The full decoration record of the AATTV across 10 years was 4 Victoria Crosses, 2 Distinguished Service Orders, 3 OBEs, 6 MBEs, 6 Military Crosses, 20 Distinguished Conduct Medals, 15 Military Medals, 4 British Empire Medals, 4 Queen's Commendations, and 49 mentions and dispatches. Beyond these, 245 American awards and 369 South Vietnamese awards were bestowed on unit members individually. Every member of the unit, regardless of their official corps, received the Infantry Combat Badge, because regardless of their designated role, every one of them had been in combat. That is what training mission had meant in practice, across 10 years of continuous service. While the AATTV earned that record, the man who had built its institutional foundation was doing something in Vietnam that almost nobody in Australia knew about. Serong handed command of the AATTV to Colonel David Jackson in February of 1965 and didn't leave Vietnam. He was seconded to the United States State Department, functioning under CIA auspices as senior advisor to South Vietnam's police field force. He left the Australian Army formally in 1968 at the rank of brigadier. From that point, his connection to the institutions he had served his entire career became something more complex and considerably less acknowledged. He prepared strategic analyses for the Rand Corporation and the Hudson Institute. He was a consultant to the Pentagon under 3 American presidents, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. An Australian brigadier helping shape American strategic thinking about a war his country was conducting on a fraction of the American scale, from inside American institutional structures, without public acknowledgement from any of the parties involved. The man who had commanded the 30 trainers, who arrived in civilian clothes in 1962, had become, in the years that followed, one of the most influential non-American voices in the prosecution of the entire war. Serong established a police field force training center at Tri Mat in the Central Highlands, applying Canungra methods to Vietnamese security forces. Initially successful, the center was eventually destroyed by institutional infighting and the bureaucratic resistance that afflicts every program originating outside the organization asked to sustain it. Robert Comer, the senior American official responsible for coordinating counterinsurgency efforts, ignored Serong's attempts to contact him entirely. The approach the Australian had refined across a decade was in Comer's institutional framework, not something to be absorbed and utilized. Taylor's reaction to Peterson's Montagnard success, "Why is an American not doing this?" encapsulates what the record shows repeatedly. The Americans could observe what the Australians had built, assess its effectiveness, and then decline to replicate it. Not through lack of resources, through a specific institutional incapacity for doctrines that did not originate with them. Was a pattern that would persist right through to the evacuation. In March of 1975, North Vietnamese forces were closing on Saigon. The South Vietnamese government made what would prove to be its final serious strategic consultation with a man described in the American congressional record as a brilliant retired Army officer of another country. Ambassador Graham Martin identified this man to Congress in 1976, obliquely, while testifying about the fall of South Vietnam. The man was Serong. He advised President Thieu to withdraw to the economically vital heartland around Saigon, abandoning the indefensible northern provinces and concentrating what remained of South Vietnamese strength on ground that could be held. The advice was sound. The strategic logic was correct. Neither the political will nor the military capacity to execute it existed by that point in the war. It was too late. On the 29th of April, 1975, Serong was among the last people evacuated from the United States Embassy in Saigon. He had arrived in Vietnam on the 31st of July, 1962. 12 years, 10 months, and 29 days. He flew home to Melbourne, returned to anonymity, and died on the 1st of October, 2002, aged 86. The same institutional silence that had enclosed Z Special Unit for 30 years, that had surrounded the Tigermen program, that had classified the SASR's work with MACVSOG, applied to him as well. A man who had been present at the beginning and the end of Australia's involvement, who had advised 3 American presidents and been consulted by the last South Vietnamese president in his final weeks of authority, died without a public accounting of any of it. The men who came home from that silence found a country that was not, for the most part, prepared to receive them. The history of what happened to Australian Vietnam veterans on their return is contested in ways that deserve honest treatment. The most dramatic accounts of organized airport protests and systematic physical assaults on returning soldiers have been challenged by serious historical investigation. Mark Dappin's Australia's Vietnam, Myth versus History, found no contemporaneous newspaper evidence of organized formal protests at airports. What the research found instead was more complicated. 15 of 16 infantry battalion tours ended in welcome home parades, some attended by crowds measured in the hundreds of thousands. The 1966 Sydney Parade drew 300,000 people. These events happened, were enthusiastically attended, and have subsequently disappeared from the collective memory of the period, replaced in popular imagination by something darker and harder to document. What the record confirms, without dispute, is different in character and no less serious for being quieter. Veterans were excluded from RSL clubs, the Returned in Services League, the institutional home of Australian military veterans, on the grounds that the Vietnam War was not a real war. Veterans were excluded from Anzac Day parades by men who had served in Korea and Malaya. The particular irony available to anyone who has read the AATTV's service history is this. Many members of the team had fought in Korea and in Malaya alongside the very men who subsequently decided that Vietnam did not qualify, men who had survived the same jungles, trained under the same doctrines, and stood in formations with these same veterans, told them that their war, which had been considerably more dangerous at the individual level than anything those veterans had experienced, did not count. This was not merely an injustice. It was an institutional failure of the specific kind that is hardest to address because it is not official policy, not a single decision made by a single authority, but the accumulated weight of individual judgments made by individuals who had earned, through their own service, the standing to make judgments that carried consequences. One veteran, Christopher Madden, described the return decades later. Even my family didn't really thank me when I returned. It was just something not spoken about. For the first 30 years of my working life afterwards, I don't think anyone knew I was a Vietnam veteran. The silence was not organized. It required no formal protest movement to produce it. It was the ambient consequence of a country that had changed its mind about the war while the men fighting it were still in the field. Soldiers absorb the atmosphere they return to. The atmosphere, whatever the size of the welcome home crowds, was not welcoming, because the country behind those crowds had divided in ways that crowds alone could not repair. Vietnam Veterans Day, the 18th of August, the anniversary of Long Tan, was designated Australia's official Vietnam Veterans Day by Prime Minister Bob Hawke in 1987. 21 years after the battle, the Vietnam Forces National Memorial on Anzac Parade in Canberra was dedicated on the 3rd of October, 1992. The AATTV's regimental badge, the green shield with the boomerang and crossbow, designed and worn in Vietnam, was not officially recognized by the Chief of the Australian Army until 2012, 50 years after the unit's formation. The investigation that produced the recognition was published in 2013. Ray Simpson died in 1978, 9 years after his Victoria Cross action. 9 years before anyone held a parade. The patience required to wait, 21 years, 50 years, was the same quality the SASR had built into its operational doctrine. Move 15 meters. Stop. Wait. Let the environment resume its natural state around you. Then move again. The veterans who waited 2 decades for a parade had been trained in a patience calibrated to operate under fire, in darkness, while men were trying to kill them. Waiting for their country to say their names properly was, in comparison, a different order of difficulty, quieter, longer, and in its way more wearing. But they waited, as they had waited in the jungle, in freeze positions lasting 30 minutes, in enemy territory that would have killed them if they moved too soon. They waited for their country to decide what it owed them. Most of them waited longer than any jungle freeze. Some of them did not survive long enough to see the answer. The fullest assessment of what they had accomplished came from a source with no institutional interest in generosity. Chamberlain's post-war analysis, the translation and examination of communist Vietnamese military documents, the interviews with former enemy officers conducted over years and across multiple countries, confirmed through hostile source evidence what the operational record had already shown. The Biat Keech classification of regular Australian infantry. The MI Rung designation produced by an army that had exhausted its natural descriptive vocabulary. The standing preference to avoid contact, except under strongly favorable conditions. The repositioning of main force units away from areas the SASR covered. The accumulated institutional conclusion of every enemy unit that had attempted the alternative, recorded in their own documents, preserved in their own veterans' testimony, still producing new findings 57 years after the events they described. The enemy had not stopped finding the Australians surprising. Even the documents kept showing it. In 1977, 2 years after Saigon fell, Colonel Charles Beckwith was given the task of building America's first dedicated counter-terrorism special operations unit. The force would become Delta Force. Beckwith understood that the doctrine which had governed American operations in Vietnam was the precise opposite of what he needed. He required a model built from different assumptions, a model that had demonstrably worked in the kind of small, independent, high-stakes environment he was designing for. He called Canberra. Veterans of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment served as instructors at the Delta Force selection course. Quietly, without the kind of formal acknowledgement that would have required American military leadership to explain why the methods it had spent a decade dismissing were now the foundation of its most prestigious unit. They taught movement discipline, they taught the patience doctrine, they taught acoustic rigor and contact drill philosophy, and the weight discipline that turned every unnecessary gram of equipment into a tactical liability. The intellectual architecture of contemporary Western special operations, small unit independence, the cultivation of invisibility as a primary tactical tool, the willingness to function in hostile territory with minimal support and maximum individual initiative, descends in direct documented lineage from an approach developed in Malaya, refined in Borneo, proved in one Vietnamese province that the world was not watching, and then carried to a selection course in the United States by men whose own country had not yet held a parade for them. The doctrine some American commanders had called insufficiently aggressive became the curriculum of the force those commanders' successors would call when there was absolutely no margin for error. No major film exists about the SASR in Vietnam. No widespread American account of what the AATTV accomplished across 10 years of advisory service. The story lives in regimental histories, in academic journals, and in the 2023 analysis of an intelligence officer who spent decades reading enemy documents and found, half a century after the events they described, that those documents were still saying things the official record had never adequately stated. Popular culture has not caught up. The story has been waiting, with the same patience the men who made it were trained to exercise. The AATTV arrived in Saigon in civilian clothes in August of 1962 because acknowledging what was being sent was diplomatically inconvenient. Barry Peterson built a 1,200-man guerrilla force in the Central Highlands for the CIA and was targeted for assassination by the Allies he was serving when his effectiveness became uncomfortable. The 4 Victoria Crosses that mark the highest individual acts of valor in Australia's entire Vietnam involvement went to men the government had called trainers and a federal MP had called expendable. Ted Serong advised 3 American presidents, was present at the beginning of Australia's involvement and the final helicopter out of Saigon, and died in Melbourne in 2002 without a public accounting. The AATTV's regimental badge was not officially recognized until 50 years after the unit's formation. The last Australian soldier listed as missing in action from the SASR's Vietnam service was not found until 2008, 37 years after the last squadron came home, and the enemy, who had every reason to say nothing generous, who had spent years trying to find a way past what these units built and could not, who had watched their own records fill with the mathematics of consistent failure, and had searched their doctrinal framework for language adequate to describe what they were facing, wrote in formal documents produced for their own commanders, using the vocabulary an army reaches for when every natural explanation has been tried and found insufficient. Ma Rung, phantoms, ghosts of the jungle. That was not sentiment, not soldiers' folklore passed around fires at night. It was a formal military assessment, produced during active fighting for institutional purposes by people trying to understand something they could not defeat. It is the most honest evaluation any military force has ever received. It was earned in silence, in jungle, that required 9 hours of patient movement to cover at 1 mile, by men who had been trained to be invisible, and who, when they came home, found that the invisibility their enemies had recorded in official documents was the same invisibility their own country had decided, for 21 years, to maintain. If this story is not in the history books you were taught from, leave a comment and tell me which part landed hardest. Subscribe. There are more stories like this one, conducted in darkness, recorded in enemy documents, acknowledged decades late, earned by men who waited with the same patience they had practiced in the field. Every one of them deserves to be told properly.